I was, I know we don't care. You don't care what I go through, but I was having a bad day Friday. Friday morning, I'd been on the phone with Cox Cable, and I lost my salvation 3 times in that. I had to ask God to forgive me of my sins, and it's never a pretty thing. And I hope no one works for Cox that's here today. And then, of course, we needed a new dishwasher, and so you can't buy just a dishwasher because it doesn't match. So we got to get a refrigerator, and so Best Buy Friday will be there between 8 and noon. And so at 5 minutes after 12, I'm on the phone with them after being on the phone with Cox Cable. And when I got done there, I'm thinking, can this day go any worse? And then I get a text saying, would you or Carter be able to preach Sunday? And it did. It got worse. And I waited. And Carter didn't respond. So I go. Ron said, "Does any of you feel inspired?" And I told him no, but I would do what I could. And so I spoke at 8 o'clock and then blew through a part of a confirmation class, and us men, we only have so many words, and so I'm right at that place, and so when I get to my limit of words, I'm done, and we'll move on. So I might be in the middle of a sentence, but I'm gonna go on. It's that time of the year. And it is, as Anglicans know, as the 1928 Book of Common Prayer Anglicans know, this is the Jessima Sundays. I don't know what a Jessima was before I became an Anglican. Never heard of. Today is Septuagesima. Next Sunday is Sexagesima. My favorite Sunday of the year. I think it was the first sermon I preached in an Anglican church, in this Anglican church, was Sexagesima, and I think I've preached 3 Sexagesima sermons. I just like saying Sexagesima, and I tell myself I'm not going to talk about this, and then I end up doing it. But this year, because Bishop Ron was going to be gone for 2 of the Jessima Sundays, there was Sexagesima and then the Quinquagesima the following Sunday. So I thought, hey, I get to do it again. And then, of course, I said, Father Carter is going to be on a cruise suffering for Jesus on Quinquagesima. So the only thing he could do is Sexagesima. So he took my Sunday. And so I'm a little... That's another thing. I'm just a little ticked off about that. But I told him this morning I'm going to do a Sexagesima sermon just, because that's all I have. But anyway, all that stupidness. So next Sunday is Sexagesima. And then the following Sunday is Quinquagesima. And each of those, of course, means 70 days, 60 days, and 50 days. So today we are 70 days from Easter. And in the medieval church, up until, and I'm amazed how the liturgical churches follow the Roman Catholic lead a lot of times. But up until 1969, we had Jessima Sundays, and they were put in place to get us ready for Lent, for Ash Wednesday. Without them, all of a sudden Ash Wednesday pops up, and all of a sudden we got to be holy and give up things for Lent. But these 3 Sundays before Lent get us get us in the mood for Lent, help us to understand a little bit about Lent. Now, it isn't exactly 70 days from today that it will be Easter. It is about 63 days, but I know that those who are very precise with their lives and everything has to be precise, that it kind of drives you crazy, but it's about 70 days until Easter, 63 days until Easter. The purpose of the 70 days is because it helps us and reminds us that in the Old Testament, we're told about the captivity of Israel, the Jewish captivity of Israel in Babylon. And that lasted, we say 70 years, but it really comes down to about 63 years that it all happened. And it is a time during that time of captivity that the Israelites, the Israel nation, finally, after all those years of being in captivity in Egypt and all the things that they went through in the 40 years in the wilderness and what took place up until this time, God was important, God was honored, but not very much. And because they found themselves in captivity for those 63 to 70 years, they turned to God in a most unusual way. They spent that time in prayer, in mourning for their sin, in mourning because they had left the God that had chosen them, that they had dishonored him in so many ways. And from that point on, there was a great turnaround in the Jewish faith and in honoring and in recognizing God as who he is. I think, to me, some of the saddest and most heartbreaking verses or passages of Scripture you find in the Old Testament is found in Psalm 137. The writer of Psalm 137 is talking about that time when Israel was captive in Babylon for those 70 years. And he writes this when he reflects on what went on. Besides the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. We put away our harps, hanging them on branches of poplar trees. For our captors demanded a song from us. Our tormentors insisted on a joyful song. Sing us one of those songs of Zion. But how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in the pagan land? And that kind of gives us an idea of how we need to really look at ourselves and see, as we enter into the Lenten season, how we have dishonored God and the effects of us not placing God or God being at the very center of our life, and the problems and the wrong-headedness and the wrong decisions that we have made maybe in the last year or in the last few months, because God has not been at the very center. We have focused too much on ourselves and not upon the one who should be at the very center of our life. And so today at Septuagesima Sunday is a day that helps us to and reminds us of where we've come from and where we're going. And as the gospel reading is today, it is taken from Matthew 20, which is of all of Jesus' parables, his stories. This is the hardest one to me. It's the hardest one of them all. It is the most difficult because you hear this story, and when you come right down to it, it is irritating, because we know that when Jesus is telling this story, the landowner is actually God the Father. It is God who says, I'm not fair in this story. That it isn't fair what happens in this story. But that's the purpose of the parables, any parable that Jesus gave, or any parable that Jesus taught. The idea of the parables was not that we would have this nice little bedtime story that we could tell our kids. The idea of the parables was, and Jesus is very clear after the first parable, he says the meaning is hidden, that you can't get it when you first hear it. That when you hear a parable of Jesus, it causes you to scratch your head and wonder, did I really hear this right? Did I really understand what Jesus said? And even now, 2,000 years later, when we read these stories, we need to come away from every single one of them saying that it just doesn't seem right. And the idea behind this story, this parable, is that it just doesn't make us feel good. It just doesn't seem to be anything right about this whole story. And how could Jesus be so unfair in his storytelling? And maybe we might think that Jesus was having a bad day, and he didn't think this one through. But yet here is this story that since that time we have tried to figure it out. And so if you come from a lot of our perspective and what we were brought up, in my case, a very fundamentalist background, but an evangelical background, you look at this story and it basically is this. And I've heard it preached many times, this passage of Scripture, this way, that it is because of God's great love for us that at the very last second of life, that very last breath that we take, the very last heartbeat that we have in this life, if we had been the worst sinner, if Adolf Hitler in the last second of his life called out to Jesus, Jesus was here and Jesus would save. Now that is true. Now we don't have very many people who accept Christ or come to Christ at a very old age. My grandfather, my pappy, he was from Tennessee. The typical Hollywood hillbilly, pappy hillbilly. That was my grandfather. No teeth, little hair sticking up here and there, and he came to Detroit and stayed with us for about a month. When he was 80 years old, I was about 4 years old. He lived to be 100. And so it was during that time. And the thing I remember about my pappy was that he would sneak into the kitchen. And back then, we always had big sugar bowls. Don't have sugar. Do we have sugar in the house anymore? But those big sugar bowls on the kitchen table, and I would see him. He would look around, and then he would go over and he'd pick up the lid and take a big spoonful like that, and then put the spoon back in and do that. Now my pap couldn't. He couldn't read. He couldn't write. Couldn't hear too well. But some way, somehow, when he was in Detroit at our house, he became a believer in Jesus Christ. And I'm so thankful that he couldn't hear, couldn't read, and couldn't write because he couldn't hear those preachers and he couldn't become holy. How some people, when they become a follower of Christ, they just everything is wrong and everything. He didn't lose his sense of humor. And I know I was about 17 or 18, and my dad asked me one day, he says, "Do you think Pap's going to heaven?" I go, why would you ask? And he says, because Pappy, he still cusses. And I says, well, I don't think God's going to keep track of, an 80 or a 90-something-year-old man, if he's cussing. That's just, it was just his language. That's what he grew up with. So anyway, my grandfather became a illustration in a couple sermons in my home church because here was this 80-year-old man who accepted Jesus at the very end of his life. And so that's that. But then there are those who are on the more social justice, the social justice warriors, you might say, that look at this passage of Scripture, and some will say, well, Jesus is teaching equality among all people, and which is good, and it's the way it should be. So others I've heard who talk about this parable, and they say it shows the inequality of pay, and we have that going on today. It's been going on for years and years and years, and so we all come at it at a different angle. We all put our spin on it. This passage of Scripture was used at a funeral service one time, and then it goes back to the fact that this person was an older person before he became a Christian. So this passage of Scripture is this story that Jesus tells. It can go from one extreme to the other. And the thing is, I think it misses the entire point that Jesus is giving it, and what Jesus wants us to see and what Jesus wants us to know, because it isn't, we can use it, but it isn't about people waiting to the last to be saved, or some unfair pay, or as Jesus mentions here in the story about jealousy or about being envious or whatever. He's not talking, that's not the primary focus. If you want to grab that and run with it for a while, but that's not the primary focus of this story. It's not about jealousy, coveting, being envious, or anything else. But it's something that's very important. And you know the story of the landowner who goes out and hires workers. At 6 o'clock in the morning, he goes, his vineyard needs to be, the picking of the grapes, it needs to be accomplished that day. And so he goes out at 6 o'clock in the morning and may have gone down to the Union Hall, and because that's where the best pickers are. And do you pick grapes? I don't know. You who are wine connoisseurs, is it picking grapes? I don't know, harvesting grapes, whatever. What is it? You're rarely sober, so yeah, I know. So anyway, he needs it done, so he goes and gets the best, and he says, whatever minimum wage is. I don't know what it is. We'll say $10. King James says 1 penny, but we know it had to be more than that. So we'll just say $10 an hour. And minimum wage, so they go out and work, and then he goes back at 9 o'clock and at 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock and then at 5 o'clock. And you know that those guys at 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock are not the ones that are going to be the best workers. They're the ones that are hiding at 6 o'clock. They're not even out of bed. But they're not around at 6, 9, 12 o'clock, but they'll start showing up about 3 or 5 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, you only got an hour to work, and you got to take some money home. So the landowner finds these and asks him, how come? How come you're not working? How come you're idle? And he says, because nobody wants to hire us. Well, there's a reason why no one wants to hire you. You're lousy workers. But, the landowner, he's got to get this job done. So he says, come on, I'll pay you what's fair, what's right, and sends them out to the vineyard. And at the end of the day, at 6 o'clock, they're all lined up to get their pay. And the landowner starts with that person who is standing there, who started at some time after 5 o'clock, and it's 6 o'clock now. He hasn't broken a sweat. His clothes are clean. He doesn't have any mud on his shoes. I mean, he's still smelling good. And he gets the pay envelope, and he opens it up. And it's not just $10 in that envelope. It's $120. It's for working 10 hours. But he only worked like 30 minutes. And so the guys up front who has been hired and worked for 12 hours, they're standing there thinking, what am I going to do with that $1,200 I just made today? I mean, this is just fantastic, out of this world. And of course, you know what happened. Now, how would it make you feel if you'd have been there that day? I know how I felt. I felt like that at 11 years old. I got hired by a car dealer, me and 2 other 11-year-old kids, to hand out flyers. And we did that. And we'd do it 3 days a week for 3 hours in the afternoon. We'd ride our bikes over there. We'd get in the car with this guy, and he'd take us to parking lots and all that. We'd hand out our flyers on cars and then get back, go home. Then on Friday, we'd get paid. That went on 3 weeks. And then on the next week, we had someone new. We all pile in the car. He shows up with 3 teenagers, 16, 17-year-olds, hoodlums. They were real hoodlums. They smoked, and they weren't nice to us 11-year-old kids. But anyway, we got in the car. We did our thing. It went on about a week. And then the next week, this guy drives us to the parking lot. He gives us all the brochure, the flyers, and says, divide them up among the 6 of you. He says, I'll see you at 5 o'clock. And so these hoodlums, they go, when he leaves, we ain't doing this. So they dump all the flyers, and they go to a matinee, a movie matinee, and us 11-year-old kids, we didn't know any better. We were out there in the hot sun. We're doing all this. That goes on for a couple of weeks, and then we show up on a Friday to get paid. This guy had been taking us out. He's not there. We don't know why. And so the guy comes out to pay us, and he starts with these 3 hoodlums. And when he gave them their little pay envelope, their cash, he goes, goodbye and good luck. He's firing them. And I'm thinking, well, they deserve to be fired. I mean, they didn't do what's right, and they're mean. They're cruel. They need to be fired. You get down to the 3 of us, and he says the same thing, goodbye and good luck. Get on your bike and get out of here. And it wasn't fair, because we did it for a week. Us 11-year-olds, we did it for a week. We handed out the flyers. The next week, we threw our flyers away and went to the movies, too. We've learned how to do that stuff. But we found out the guy who was our boss, when he said, I'll see you at 5 o'clock, he was messing around with his girlfriend, and his wife found out about it. And she called and let them know. And then someone else found the flyers in a trash can and turned those in. And so we were all fired. It wasn't fair, because we basically were doing our job. We were doing, for 11-year-old, we were doing a good job. So and same things happen to you. You know what it's like to not be treated fairly. And that's what's going on here. It's not fair. It just isn't fair. And that's irritating. That's annoying, because we think God's going to be fair. After all, he's God. Jesus is fair. We look at this and we might think that this story that Jesus kind of pulled out of thin air and wanted to tell this story. But really, when you see how Matthew puts it in the context of everything that he's putting together in his gospel, it really has its beginning in chapter 18 of Matthew, where the disciples came to Jesus and asked, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And you remember what Jesus did. He took a little child, placed it among them, and said, I tell you the truth, that unless you turn from your sins and become like little children, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven. So anyone who becomes as humble as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. You would think that after a few weeks or a few months, the disciples would get this. But here it is. They're asking Jesus, who is the greatest? Who is going to be the highest honor? Who is going to be the greatest of the 12 of us? Of the 12 of us, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus gives them this really riveting illustration. Human illustration of you have to be like this little child. You have to be like one of these little kids running around in here. You got to be humble. We don't think they act humble sometimes, but these little kids are humble kids. And if you're going to enter into the kingdom of heaven, you have to be like one of those little children. Okay, fine. The disciples should have got that. I mean, they're looking right at it. They're looking right at that little kid. You got to be like that little kid. Got to be humble. You thought they'd learned their lesson, but in chapter 19, verse 13, you find that one day some parents brought their children to Jesus so that he could lay hands on them and pray for them. But the disciples scolded the parents for bothering Jesus. But Jesus said, let the children come to me. Don't stop them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who are like these children. Disciples hadn't learned a thing. They're still wanting to know who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Who's the most important one of us? Who do you think's the most important one, Jesus? They don't understand. They don't get it. And in between this incident again, where Jesus has the little children with him and he blesses them, and this story, we find that Matthew said there was a rich man that came and asked Jesus, what do I do to have eternal life? What do I do to get into the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus gives him this little list, and he said, I've done all that. Jesus says, well, how about this? How about you give everything you have to the poor and come follow me? And the man leaves. And when Peter and the disciples heard this, they were just amazed, because the rich people are the ones that are in the kingdom of heaven, because that meant if you had money, God was blessing you. God was taking care of your need. God was, you were just a great individual. And they're shocked to hear that this could happen, that poor people may get into heaven before a rich person. It's almost an impossibility for a rich person to get into heaven. And then Peter comes and asks Jesus this question. We've given up everything to follow you. What will we get? I mean, they're concerned about who's the greatest, but now it's getting right down to, we've given up everything. What are we going to get out of this? What are we going to get out of following Christ? Well, I'll get into this in a minute, but that's where I find myself sometimes. That's where in occasions in our lives, we find ourselves. What are we going to get out of this? What do we get out of following Christ? We're not really concerned about going to heaven in the future. We want something now. We got to have it now. This eternal life stuff, that's well and good, and that's important. I don't want to go to hell, but I want something now. And then Jesus says these words in the last of chapter 19 and verse 30. But many who are the greatest now will be the least important then. And those who seem least important now will be the greatest then. And then Jesus launches into this story of the kingdom of heaven is like. So you have the disciples' first question, who's the greatest? Then you find the disciples say again, what do we get for following you? After all, they were God's chosen people. They were been called by God. Jewish people that God so loved that he chose them out of all the peoples of the world. And so not only were they God's chosen people, but here these disciples, and maybe some of the religious leaders that was hanging around hearing and that heard this story, are feeling the same way too, that they are God's chosen people. But the disciples go one step further, and it says, we followed you. We're your disciples. So if we followed you and we're your disciples, we ought to get something out of this. We deserve something out of this because we've given up so much. And you can almost hear the disciples mouthing the words that the person who is murmuring in this story is saying. In verse 12 of Matthew 20, the one who had worked the longest says, those people worked only an hour, and yet you've paid them just as much as you paid us, who worked all day in the scorching heat. What he said was, you've made those people, you've made those losers, you've made those individuals who they couldn't work 15 minutes in 8 hours. You've made them equal with us. You've put them on the same level with us. And it's not fair. Verse 13. The landowner answered one of them and said this, friend. Now, this wasn't his friend. When I was in Bible college, I had to go to the dean quite a bit because I got in trouble. And every time I went to the dean, the first words out of his mouth was, listen, friend. Now, I knew I wasn't his friend because he never invited me over for dinner. But he was always ready to hand out a demerit or two. And in the same way, when I read this, I hear friend, I know exactly what the landowner is saying. You're not my friend. Hey, listen, buddy. I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work all day for the usual wage? Now take your money and go. I wanted to pay this last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others? It's not fair. But when you understand what Jesus is teaching, it is fair. Because Jesus isn't talking about pay equality or minimum wage or the last person on the last breath that they're going to go to heaven if they call out to Jesus. Jesus is saying that God's grace is given to all. God's grace, that unmerited favor, that loving kindness, that undeserved love, that undeserved mercy that you get and I get is given to all. It's available to us winners. It's given to those who are the losers. It is those who worked for 12 hours all day long in the scorching sun and the heat of the day. And it is also given, the grace of God is given to that person who just shows up for the last 15 minutes and gets the exact same thing that you do when you follow Christ. It's a story of God's grace. It's a story of God's loving kindness in His favor. It's a story of God's goodwill that He extends to all of us. And you know, for some of us, when we hear the grace of God, the grace of God is scary. We want to put limits on it, and there are limits. Jesus talked about when there are some problems in the church, He gives us a method on how to take care of those problems, because He's not talking about license or anything like that. But there is this sense that when you're talking about God's grace, His love, His mercy extends to all people. And that kind of rubs us the wrong way. We don't feel right about that. Because, well, you might be sitting on this side. I'm not saying that you are. Well, I know you are, but I'm not saying this is actually happening. But you could be sitting right here, and you could be looking over to this front row over here and just pick out one of these four people and say, hey, I'm better than those guys. I mean, I saw what one of them did the other day. I know how they are. And if you look at life, you go through life and you keep the records. I mean, you're a great bookkeeper, and you can remember what someone else has said and someone else done that doesn't measure up to your standard of what a Christian, what a follower of Jesus Christ should be, or even what an individual is. Then you'll miss the grace of God. You'll be just like this guy who worked 12 hours a day, poor old guy. But you'll miss the grace of God. If you're continually analyzing and looking at what other people do, the things that they do, if that is your primary focus in life, you miss the grace of God. You don't even begin to understand what the grace of God, the loving favor of God is all about. And what Jesus is saying to His disciples is, it doesn't matter who the greatest is in the kingdom of heaven. That ought to be the last thing. That shouldn't even be on your mind. And you shouldn't be looking at it at how you're going to get something out of following me. That's the last thing, because you'll miss the grace of God. You'll miss the loving kindness of God. You'll miss the goodwill of God in your life, because you're always focusing on someone else and what they've done, what they do. And you miss the glorious graciousness of God that He offers His love to all of us. I read somewhere that for those who keep score, they're going to enjoy hell. That's what hell is going to be. Remember the story that Jesus told of the Pharisee and the publican who go to the temple to pray, and the Pharisee looks over at this loser, and he says, God, I'm thankful I'm not like this man. I'm thankful I don't act like him. I think I don't believe like he does. I'm thankful, can go on down the line. And then the publican, all he does is say, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus asked the question, who is the one that went home justified that day? Was it the winner or the loser? It was the one that understood the grace of God. So the grace of God isn't fair because it's extended to all. But that's God. And that's the way grace is supposed to be from God, that it's given to all. And so on this Sunday, this Septuagesima Sunday, as the sun will set sometime today, perhaps there's a need in your life as we are getting ready to enter into the season of Lent. That we also, as the sun goes down on this day, that the sun also goes down on our attitudes that we have toward others and our judgments that we place on other people. Because if we want to know the grace of God, we can't go through life being the decider of who's right and who's wrong. But if we want to go through life as Jesus says we should go through life, we humble ourselves like a little child. Who are those little children who gathered around Jesus only saw him and they loved him? And to humble yourself means that you are focused on him and you love your neighbor as you love yourself. Last night I was kind of messing around, trying to find anything I could on this parable. But anyway, I don't know how I ended up on this website, but I honestly, I don't like to talk about this stuff. I don't even like to think about this stuff, and yet it's so prevalent today. You can't get away from it, of the sexual abuse and all this stuff, and it's just crazy. But anyway, we're all aware that this week this doctor, Larry Nassar, who was convicted this week of abusing the female gymnast. I saw this quote by Rachel Denhollander, who was the first female athlete to go public in the accusations against Larry Nassar. And of course, this week, the accusers got to say their piece, got to stand there before Larry Nassar and say what was on their heart. But Rachel Denhollander had this to say, and this is just part of what she said. Because what she says just fits so well with what Jesus is saying about grace. She said this, so she stood before Larry and said, "You spoke of praying for forgiveness. But Larry, if you had read the Bible you carry, you know that forgiveness does not come from doing good things, as if good things can erase what you have done. The Bible you carry says it is better for a stone to be tied around your neck and you thrown into the lake than for you to even cause one child to stumble. And you have damaged hundreds. The Bible you carry speaks of a final judgment where all of God's wrath and eternal terror is poured out on men like you. Should you ever reach the point of truly facing what you have done, the guilt will be crushing. And that is what makes the gospel of Christ so sweet. Because it extends grace and hope and mercy where none should be found. And it will be there for you. I pray you experience the soul-crushing weight of guilt so that you may someday experience true repentance and true forgiveness from God, which you need far more than forgiveness from me, though I extend that to you as well. She understands the grace of God. Not to get away from, he's going to suffer, he's going to pay. But she knew that the grace of God is extended to the man that had damaged her life. Not fair, but it's God's grace. And it is the grace that is extended to every single one of us today. And if you think you deserved it, you don't know God's grace. You don't know his loving kindness. You don't know his favor. So my prayer is that on Septuagesima, that we humbly give ourselves to Christ and say, where I have become hard and where I have become the decider and where I have passed judgment on others, that I will find that place in my heart that I seek forgiveness and I can experience the grace of God in all that it is in my life. Let's pray. Well, Father, that story that you gave only scratches the surface of God's great grace for us. Every single one of us in this building doesn't deserve your mercy. Every single one of us in this building doesn't deserve your love. But you love. And you give mercy. And you've offered grace to every single one of us. I pray that we can receive it. May it become the primary focus of our life, of their great grace for us, that we may be able to extend the love of the Father to others. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.